Welcome back, and our next guest is Don Wilkins, who is a county government reporter with the Messenger-Inquirer. Don, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, well listen, Kentucky just conducted its first ever Republican caucus on March 5th, and we're going to talk about caucuses and kind of explain that process. But before we get into that, I'd like for you to kind of tell me, give us some background about yourself.
I was born and raised here in Davis County, and I graduated from Western Kentucky University from their journalism program back in '97, and after I graduated, I landed a job at the Ohio County Times News, and then in 2000 I was promoted to editor, and I ran that newspaper from 2000 until 2011, and then came here at the Messenger-Inquirer then. Okay. And so yeah, almost it's hard to believe, almost 20 years in journalism, but once it gets in your blood, it's something that unless you're in it, you just don't understand.
Right.
You know?
Well, let me ask you a quick question on that. And what would you say is the biggest change in journalism that you've personally witnessed from the first time you got involved in it until now?
Well, obviously the internet, the social media, but I can tell you, for me, even when I started in '97, that was at the very start of like digital cameras. So digital cameras were just coming on. So I have hours of my life I can't get back from the darkroom, and plus I was a print guy, not really a photo guy, and so for me the greatest change was the digital camera, you know. So, but yeah, obviously the internet and social media have played a role, and so the newspapers have had to adapt to that, and I think the Messenger-Inquirer has done very well in adapting, to that process. Where it's hurt in some ways, it's helped us in ways we've been able to, the way we paginate our pages, the way we are able to, because we have a pagination hub here where the Paxton Media, who owns the M&I. I mean, they put together papers across the country, several, and so they just send a digital file over to those presses in those particular cities, Durham, North Carolina, for example. Wow. And so in that respect, it's changed things, but at the same time, we've had to find ways to adapt and compete, and it's regardless, I still like to hold my paper in my hand,
That's something that has been kind of difficult for me to change too also. It's there's something about that traditional ritual that I go through in the morning to have coffee and read the paper, and I'm actually holding it. Yeah. I'm finding myself now on my pad doing it, but it for some reason it's just not the same.
Yeah, and there is something to be said. Newspapers, they're especially here we're a daily, but we still have we cover a lot of local, such as local government and fiscal court and city government, and the typical person, whether you maybe get your news on Facebook, but the typical person is not going to fiscal court, or they're not going to county government, and so we still play that kind of that watchdog, and so that's a very to me the most important role that we have as a newspaper is to be that watchdog and to keep that transparency open between our elected officials and our governments and with the public.
Absolutely. Well, listen, let's jump into this, and first, Don, I want you to explain, what is a caucus?
Well, a caucus, well, when you get into it, it could be whether you go to it's an election, or it can be making policy. So the caucus we just had was whenever a particular party was it was the Republicans who decided that they wanted to have a caucus this year. That's the election side of it. But up in Frankfort, you have the General Assembly going right now. They have a caucus, Republican, Democrat caucus up there, but they're deciding policy.
Right.
So they'll get together and decide what they want to champion, what they don't want to, and so forth. But this caucus was just mainly about who the Republicans wanted to have as their Republican nominee for president.
Okay. Normally, though, over the years, I have always voted to where it was a primary. So what is the difference between a caucus and a primary?
Well, in this particular case, it was, for one, a party-run event, where the primaries are state-run, and and so you had instead of having to go to your precincts, like you would normally do, and all these different, depending on where you lived and so forth, they just had it at one location, which was at Davis County High School, and if you were a Republican, that's where you went to cast your vote for the presidential nominee last Saturday. And so, and another difference, and probably a big difference, was because it was party run. Something you probably you won't see at a primary is the electioneering. They were allowed to have candidates or representatives from the candidates there, so people wanted to talk to them. I mean, I even saw where they were handing out cookies to people, as they were going through the line, and so primaries, whenever it's a state-sponsored election, no electioneering. There was a big deal about how far you could even have a sign close to a precinct. Now they did require that any campaign booths that were set up to be 25 feet away from the actual voting area. So they did try to keep the ballot process private in that respect, but at the same time, it did give you that element of, maybe if you were on the fence and somebody said, hey, this is what my guy can do better than your guy, then it may have swayed you from one way to the other. Right,
that's interesting. Now, explain how the caucus works, and are all caucuses the same?
No, ours was, and they purposely did this, ours was more like if you were used to just voting, going to your primary and voting and casting your vote and walking out. That's what they tried to do with this. But there are other primaries, such as the Iowa caucus, which I guess is probably the most famous of them all, where it's like an event. People will go, and candidates will often give stump speeches, and they get real rowdy, and then and some of them, I don't know if they do this, but they'll, instead of casting a ballot, they'll just raise their hands, who they want to vote for, and if you and like I said, I don't know if the Iowa caucus is this way or not, but in some cases, if it's 15% or less, if your candidate doesn't get that support, then that support is supposed to go to another candidate. So they wanted to make it where you could get in and out of this particular caucus and not, so basically however long it took you to stand in line and then cast your vote, you were done. So maybe an hour for some people, maybe some less. So you weren't committing a half a day or a whole day like some caucuses do.
Well, let me ask you this: why did the Republican Party decide to hold a caucus?
Well, that was initiated by Rand Paul, U.S. Senator Rand Paul, and that was because he was running for U.S. President and U.S. Senator. And state law says you can't be on the same ballot for two different elections. So he reached out to the Republican Party of Kentucky, the RPK, and said, hey, what about looking at a caucus this year? So that way it would allow him to be on the ballot per se, and for this caucus, and then also allow him to be on the ballot in May for the primary.
I see.
And the other thing about this too, he volunteered to kick in some money, because like I said, it was a party run thing, and so there is a cost, to this, even though it was mainly run by volunteers at the local level. But there is a cost, to everything, of course.
I understand. I think we did some research the other day when we were talking about this in the office, and I think it was like $250,000 he paid, and then he was going to pay maybe another $250,000 or something for that. So yes, you're right. It is extremely costly.
Yeah, and so of course he dropped out weeks before the race, and so whenever I was talking with the state Republican people and even the local Republican people, I said, how does this affect things for you? It was one of the stories that I did once Rand dropped out. So it went from supporting Rand to, hey, now at least we get to be part of this voting process, because they said, by the time it got to May, instead of having 5 candidates out there or 6 or whatever, we might be down to 1 or 2, and so we're not really part of that process to get to pick who we want to be the presidential nominee. So they looked at it from just being able to play more of a role in the election process.
Right.
And so I understand that. Now whether or not they'll continue to do that because of the cost, we'll see, because they do have a choice. Because I asked them, I said, well, do you think you'll continue having a caucus in 4 years? And they said, well, we'll just have to see how this works out, and maybe it may just have to see if somebody's willing to pony up the dough again.
Right.
So.
Well, see, that was really my next question, is once you go to a caucus situation, do you have to continue doing that every year?
No, it's a choice.
Okay.
Because like I said, it is a party-run thing. It's like the Democrats, they're just going to have the primary. And leading up, or even the day of the primary, there were folks and other media outlets saying that this was the first ever caucus for Kentucky. Well, according to the Kentucky Secretary of State, actually the Democrats and the Republicans had caucuses back in 1984 here in Kentucky.
Oh.
And so I don't know if folks, for whatever reasons, I don't remember it because I was 11 years old,
right,
and couldn't vote. So,
right.
I don't know. That's their job. The Secretary of State, that's their job to keep up with that. So I have no reason to doubt it. But even at the people at the RPK, that's a lot of them were saying that too. So maybe they just don't remember it either. Maybe a lot of them were 11 years old at the time. So, but I went with the Secretary of State because, like I said, that is their sole job. Well, not sole job, but it's one of their main jobs is to keep up with elections. Even though it wasn't state sponsored, but they would know, whether or not we had a caucus or not. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, and I bet you there's some people who are thinking this out there. Are we still going to have a primary?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. The difference will be you won't be able to, if you're a Republican, you won't be able to vote for U.S. president. But Rand Paul will be on there as a U.S. senator, and last time I looked, I think he had 2 or 3 other challengers on there. So you go in there and vote for whoever you want as a Republican. And that's the thing too, with these primaries, not all of them. Ours is you can only vote for your party. The guy or the party that, if you're Republican, you can only vote for Republicans, and Democrat, you can only vote for Democrats.
Right.
And independents, we can't vote
right.
at all.
Exactly.
So, but there are some primaries that they consider open, and then there are some that actually call what you call the pick-a-party. Believe it or not, you can go in there the day of if you're independent. Or if you're a Democrat but you want to vote for a Republican, you can change your party affiliation that day.
Wow.
For our caucus that we just had, you had to be a registered Republican by December 31st
right.
of 2015. If not, you couldn't vote in the caucus. Now you should be able to vote in the primary, but if you were sitting there, in February and say, hey, I might want to do this, but I'm an independent or I was a Democrat. You went down there you wouldn't be able to vote in the caucus
right.
at that point. So,
well, Don, this has been great information. I really appreciate it. I tried to do my research before I had you on, but you've also shared some more information that's educated me even better. So I appreciate you coming.
Yeah,
on.
it'd be interesting to see if they continue this caucus process. Like I said, money will probably play the biggest role in it the next time around, but also they'll get feedback from the voters on whether or not they were too confused with it or how convenient it was, because there is some convenience about being able to just go to whatever your local precinct is, because it's usually the closest place to your house, and plus you don't have to stand in line as long as you do just having one place to go vote. So I guess we'll see in 4 years, but I guess they'll make that determination whenever it gets a little closer, and so time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Don, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
you having me.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in to 71 Magazine. On behalf of all of us here at OCTV, we'll see you back here in April.